In the heart of a dense, unbroken forest, a man named Ethan lived in complete solitude. His cabin, a small wooden structure with a slanted roof and a creaky door, was miles away from the nearest town. It sat in a clearing surrounded by towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The forest was his home, his refuge, and his prison all at once. Ethan had chosen this life, leaving behind the noise and chaos of the world to find peace. But peace was not what he found. Ethan had lived in the forest for nearly 5 years. At first, the isolation was comforting. The sound of the wind rustling through the leaves, the chirping of birds, and the occasional crackle of a fire became his companions. He spent his days hunting, fishing, and tending to a small garden he had cultivated behind the cabin. His evenings were quiet, spent reading by the light of a single oil lamp or staring out the window at the moonlit woods. For a time, he thought he had found the perfect life. But as the months turned into years, strange things began to happen. At first, they were small and easy to dismiss. Ethan would hear faint whispers carried on the wind, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. He chalked it up to his imagination or the sounds of animals moving through the brush. Sometimes he would find items in his cabin moved ever so slightly from where he had left them. A book on the table, a knife in the kitchen, or a chair pushed back just an inch. He blamed his own forgetfulness. Then the occurrences became harder to ignore. One night, as Ethan lay in bed, he was jolted awake by a loud banging on the cabin wall. His heart pounded as he sat up, listening intently. The banging came again, 3 sharp knocks as if someone or something was demanding to be let in. Ethan grabbed his rifle and crept to the door. He flung it open, expecting to find a bear or maybe a lost traveler. But there was nothing, just the cold night air and the endless trees staring back at him. The next morning, Ethan found footprints in the dirt outside his cabin. They were human footprints, large and deep, as if someone heavy had been standing there. They led away from the cabin and disappeared into the forest. Ethan followed them for a while, but they seemed to vanish into thin air. Shaken but determined to stay rational, he convinced himself that it was just a hunter passing through. Weeks passed, and the disturbances grew more frequent. Ethan would wake up to find his front door wide open, though he was certain he had locked it before bed. His food supplies began to dwindle faster than he could explain. At night, he often heard the sound of footsteps crunching on the leaves outside, circling the cabin. Sometimes he thought he saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of his lamp's light. But whenever he tried to get a closer look, it would vanish. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest was swallowed by darkness, Ethan decided he had had enough. He lit a large fire in the clearing and sat outside with his rifle, determined to confront whatever was tormenting him. The night was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of the forest absent. He sat for hours, his eyes scanning the darkness, but nothing happened. Just as he began to relax, he heard a low, guttural growl behind him. Ethan spun around, his heart racing. At the edge of the clearing stood a figure, barely visible in the flickering firelight. It was tall, its limbs unnaturally long, and its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. Ethan froze, unable to move or speak. The creature tilted its head, as if studying him, and then it let out a chilling, inhuman scream. Ethan raised his rifle and fired, the sound echoing through the trees. When he looked again, the creature was gone. That night, Ethan did not sleep. He sat in his cabin with the door locked and his rifle in his lap, waiting for dawn. When the first light of day broke through the trees, he ventured outside to find no trace of the creature. No footprints, no blood, nothing to prove that it had ever been there. But Ethan knew what he had seen, and he knew it was real. Over the next few days, Ethan's fear turned to paranoia. He barely left the cabin, venturing outside only to gather water or firewood. He boarded up the windows and reinforced the door, but the feeling of being watched never left him. At night, he could hear the creature's growls and screams echoing through the forest. Sometimes it sounded close, as if it were right outside the cabin. Other times, it seemed distant, a reminder that it was always there, watching and waiting. One morning, Ethan awoke to find strange symbols carved into the walls of his cabin. They were crude and unfamiliar, but they filled him with a sense of dread. He tried to erase them, but no matter how hard he scrubbed, the marks remained. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than before. They seemed to come from inside the cabin, surrounding him and filling his mind with a sense of overwhelming terror. Ethan knew he couldn't stay in the forest any longer. He packed what little he could carry and prepared to leave at first light. But as he stepped outside, he found the clearing shrouded in an unnatural fog. The trees seemed closer than before, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The path he had walked so many times was gone, replaced by an impenetrable wall of darkness. For days, Ethan wandered through the forest, trying to find his way out. But no matter which direction he went, he always ended up back at the cabin. The whispers followed him, growing louder and more sinister. He began to see shadows moving among the trees, always just out of reach. The creature appeared to him more frequently, its glowing eyes a constant reminder of his hopelessness. Ethan's mind began to unravel. He stopped sleeping, too afraid of what might happen if he closed his eyes. He barely ate, his supplies running low and his appetite consumed by fear. The cabin, once a sanctuary, had become a prison. He felt as though the forest itself was alive, conspiring to trap him forever. One night, as the whispers reached a deafening crescendo, Ethan made a decision. He grabbed his rifle and stepped outside, determined to face the creature once and for all. The fog was thicker than ever, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. He called out into the darkness, his voice trembling but resolute. "I'm not afraid of you," he shouted, though his shaking hands betrayed the lie. For a moment, there was silence. Then the creature emerged from the shadows, its tall, twisted form illuminated by the pale moonlight. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, its glowing eyes locked onto Ethan. He raised his rifle and fired, but the bullet seemed to pass through the creature without effect. It let out a low, menacing growl and began to advance. Ethan turned and ran, his heart pounding in his chest. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees forming a labyrinth of darkness. He could hear the creature behind him, its heavy footsteps growing louder with each passing second. No matter how fast he ran, it was always just a step behind. In a desperate attempt to escape, Ethan stumbled into a small cave hidden among the trees. He crawled inside and huddled in the darkness, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The creature's growls echoed outside, but it did not enter. For hours, Ethan sat in the cave, too afraid to move. When dawn finally broke, he emerged to find the forest eerily quiet. But the peace was short-lived. As the days turned into weeks, the creature's presence became more oppressive. It no longer hid in the shadows, but followed Ethan openly, its glowing eyes a constant reminder of his impending doom. The whispers in his mind grew louder, filling him with thoughts that were not his own. He began to see visions of the forest consuming him, its twisted branches wrapping around him and pulling him into the darkness. Ethan's last entry in his journal, found years later by a group of hikers, read, "The forest has taken me. I am no longer alone." The hikers never found Ethan, but they spoke of a feeling of being watched and the faint sound of whispers that seemed to follow them as they left the clearing. The cabin remains there to this day, abandoned and overgrown, a haunting reminder of the man who disappeared into the forest, never to be seen again.